Alice Keppel was Edward III's much younger mistress. When she heard he was on his deathbed, she rushed to the gates of Buckingham Palace, waving a letter. The guards reluctantly led her in, a decision they came to regret when they heard what she did inside. We'll get more into that story later on. You could say that Alice Keppel was born with quite the dainty silver spoon in her mouth. Her family were prominent members of the English nobility and direct descendants of the royal house of Stuart. Alice was the very picture of the Victorian ideal of beauty. She had wide blue eyes, a tiny waist, and, most infamously, a large buxom chest. But she had another secret weapon. She was also extremely clever, and in a very particular way. While swanning about Victorian drawing rooms, Alice had an incredible gift for keeping conversation going, directing it where she wanted to go, and avoiding where she didn't want to go. In other words, she could be very discreet, and that skill set was about to serve her very well. In the summer of 1891, the 23-year-old Alice got married. Her groom was the dashing and honorable Lieutenant Colonel George Keppel, a soldier whose family had a deep history of serving the royal family. Yet, although Alice's new husband possessed a strong dose of dignity, he was lacking one very important thing. George Keppel's soldierly income didn't exactly cover all of Alice's burgeoning expensive tastes, and they often had far less money than they wanted. Now, some people would take up a second job at this point, but that is not what Alice did. She had a very bizarre solution to her financial problems. She decided to target wealthy men and strike up extramarital affairs with them, essentially using her renowned beauty and discretion to become a Victorian sugar baby. And guess what? Like everything else Alice put her mind to, she was very good at it. So what exactly did George Keppel have to say about all of this? Well, here is the truly shocking part. Little known fact, Victorians weren't actually prudes. Many of them, especially in the high-class circles Alice Keppel ran in, were delightfully naughty. So, while Alice was out servicing wealthy men, her husband George was 100% supportive of her. He even engaged in some of his own affairs, and once said, "I do not mind what she does as long as she comes back to me in the end." So, he was surprisingly open-minded about the whole thing. Then, in 1898, Alice Keppel met her destiny. The 29-year-old socialite met none other than Prince Edward, the eldest son of Queen Victoria and the heir to the English throne. At the time, Alice had no idea that this chance meeting would change her life forever. By this time, the Prince of Wales had quite the reputation for scandal. Although married to Alexandra of Denmark, he had scores of trysts with beautiful actresses and noble women all throughout England. Historians believed he had at least 55 liaisons throughout his life, but that estimate is probably on the very low end. And that wasn't all. Prince Edward was notorious for his enormous appetites, both carnal and gastronomic, and he even earned the nickname Dirty Bertie for all his crazy antics. As he got on in weight and age, the royal was 56 years old when he met Alice, so old enough to be her father. But of course, that didn't stop him. He had spent most of his youth sneaking in and out of beautiful married women's bedrooms, so it must have been a shock to him to find George Keppel so accommodating to this affair. The Prince of Wales was a frequent visitor to the Keppel home in Mayfair, and each time he arrived, George made sure to be just on his way out. Very clever. And also, somehow it was still so awkward. Edward had become accustomed to getting whatever he wanted the instant that he wanted it, and this often led to tantrums and mood swings. Alice's response was brilliant. With her calm, clever gift of the gab, she became a kind of king whisperer and was one of the very few people in Edward's life who could reliably talk him down. As one witness commented, he was a much pleasant child since he changed mistresses. But Alice Keppel was not some selfless Victorian angel. Oh no, far from it. In fact, she took full advantage of her new unofficial position by rewarding herself lavishly. She made sure the prince paid her out in the form of royal endowments, and she also got cushy jobs for both her husband and her brother through her royal connections. Of course, that was just within her own personal circle. She also showed influence in other areas. When Alice became royal mistress, she shook the palace right up in the best way possible. But people in court were shocked at just how far she was willing to go and what she was willing to do in order to protect her new position. The one person who might have gotten in Alice Keppel's way was Edward's wife, Alexandra of Denmark. Naturally, the two women would have been enemies. But you see, Alexandra was used to dealing with Edward's previous side piece, Daisy Grubble, who was brash and loud about her bedroom association with royalty. Alice, by contrast, knew just what to do to get Alexandra on her side. Instead of blabbing to anyone who would listen about her new royal conquest, Alice did the smart thing and kept her mouth politely and tightly shut. In fact, she was so well-bred, gracious, and discreet about her favor with the future king. To entrench herself further on Alexandra's good side, Alice also tried to help Edward choose gifts for his wife, and she was very good at it too. She even once helped to create a set of Faber animals since Alexandra collected them. And finally, it seemed like all of Alice Keppel's hard work was going to pay off. In 1901, she got a major life upgrade. That year, Queen Victoria passed away, ending the Victorian Age and ushering the Prince of Wales onto the throne as King Edward III. The new Edgewardian era had begun, and Alice was right smack in the middle of the period. With Edward as monarch, his young mistress started acting as a go-between for her lover and his ministers. And believe me, she was powerful. Many of King Edward II's steals began and ended with Alice Keppel, and they happened in a surprising place, her very own drawing room. It became a regular occurrence for her to put on yet another dinner, and then use the opportunity to sneakily get an arguable topic dropped into conversation just to gauge the effect, which of course was then reported right back to the king. But the thing is, she really wanted all of this to be top secret. Although the Prime Minister of England, Herbert Henry Asquith, once praised Alice's wise counsel, she hated, and I mean hated, whenever anyone explicitly brought up her political influence, and she preferred it to stay only between people in the number. When the Prime Minister's wife, Margot Aske, once talked about her as the king's advisor, the royal mistress was furious. But before long, she had much bigger things to worry about. You see, Alice Keppel was one of the most persuasive women in all of England, and she could bend the ear of the king like nobody's business. But she did have one fatal limit. No matter how hard she tried, Alice could never convince the king to give up his material pleasures of smoking and eating. Even while she tried to keep his appetite satisfied in the bedroom, this would have dire consequences. Edward was living like he was immortal, but of course, he couldn't be more wrong. Eventually, the king's life of excess and hedonism caught up to him in the worst way possible. Starting in 1909, the wear and tear on Edward's body became too big to ignore. Soon enough, Alice's royal lover was falling apart. In addition to developing a raging case of bronchitis from his cigar habit, King Edward III also got a rodent ulcer on his nose, which is actually a type of skin cancer. He took a radium cure to zap the cancer away, but he still wasn't exactly in the best shape. And then disaster struck in February of that year. He lost consciousness for a brief moment while on a state visit, and then in March of 1910, during another diplomatic trip to France, the king completely collapsed, necessitating a prolonged stay in the foreign country to Canaleles and return home to Alice. Yet, as we'll see, this homecoming was the opposite of happy. Once King Edward came back to dear old Blighty in the spring of 1910, it all came completely undone. Before Alice even had the chance to properly reunite with her lover, Edward suffered several heart attacks in a row on May the 6th in 1910. But that wasn't the worst part. Unable to admit any kind of defeat, the monarch refused to even lie down, saying, "No, I shall not give in. I shall go on. I shall work to the end." It was Alice who had lived to regret it. When she got the news that the king was at the Grim Reaper's door, the normally composed woman completely broke down, busting through the palace and running to be at his bedside. Although Queen Alexandra graciously let her in, the situation was pretty awkward, and the consort's nerves were reasonably rattled about the whole situation. Well, they would not get any better. With Edward surrounded by his family and his lover, he dropped a bombshell of a sentence. According to law, the alien king looked at his beloved Alice Keppel, then returned to Alexandra of Denmark and insisted that she kiss Alice, as though this commandment would help smooth out the tensions in the room. Spoiler, it only made things 10 times worse and destroyed what little remaining tolerance the queen had for the king's mistress. I mean, considering the circumstances, Alexandra would have been completely disgusted. So, it's no wonder the queen turned to Alice and sternly asked her to leave the room. But no one could have predicted what would come next. When Alice realized the Queen of England had given her direct command and that she would never see King Edward alive again, she took the situation from awkward to horrific. Alice Keppel's famous composure failed her, and she broke down into ragged, messy sobs, screaming, "I never did any harm. There was nothing wrong between us. What is to become of me?" Sadly, it didn't end there. Alice was so beside herself and nearly out of her mind that she couldn't even leave the king's bedside of her own free will. Eventually, more stoic members of the royal household had to drag her out of the room, still sobbing and screaming, and they all but threw her out into the street. This would have been absolutely humiliating. As the dust settled in the aftermath of Alice's grief-stricken outburst, she was so mortified about her own behavior and uncharacteristic impropriety that she actually tried to pretend it never happened and downplayed the event when she discussed it later on. It took a long time for her to openly admit the truth of that day, and maybe even longer to come to terms with what happened next. Just after 11:30 in the evening of May 6, 1910, King Edward III breathed his last breath, passing at the age of 68. The king's death wasn't just the end of the Edwardian era. It was also the end of Alice Keppel's ascendancy in the royal court. So, while the world prepared to give the monarch a state funeral, Alice planned to say her final goodbye. When the palace laid the king to rest on May 17th, the now Dowager Queen Alexandra again allowed Alice to attend, but there was a disgraceful catch. In an obvious gesture to her illicit relationship with the king, the royal family forced Alice to enter and leave through a side door. Even though that must have been very painful, there was still more pain on the way. Alice had spent practically all her tenure as royal mistress trying not to offend people. But try as she might, her innately scandalous position made her enormous enemies. Among them was Edward's son and heir, the new King George V, and his wife, Mary of Teck. When the new monarchs set up their own court, they made sure it adhered to more traditional, less debauched guidelines, and they pointedly barred Alice from membership. With the king lying cold in the ground, Alice had to make a heartbreaking decision. Once the darling of the Edwardian age, she found herself kicked out from many of the drawing rooms that she used to light up. Feeling the heat, she and her husband George left England entirely with their small family in November 1910, just a handful of months after Edward's passing. The Keppels only returned to England at last, after decades away from their mother country in the lead-up to World War II, and they came back to find their lives completely altered. It was currently 1940, firmly within the 20th century and its technology, and they were now, open marriage or not, the quaint old-fashioned relics of a bygone time. Still, that wasn't the only thing that made them uncomfortable. Although Alice intimately understood King Edward II's monarchy, She could barely recognize it now. After all, it had gone through a rollicking change. In the 1930s, King Edward II's grandson, Edward VIII, was on the throne. But in 1936, he gave it all up and abdicated for his own royal mistress, Wallis Simpson. When Alice Keppel heard that news, her reaction was surprising. Coming from a time where royal mistresses were merely necessary soothers of the king's troubles, she was extremely unimpressed with this younger Edward's schoolboy antics about his side piece Wallis. When talking about this scandal, she said things were done much better in my day. But regardless of how she felt about a modernizing England by 1947, Alice Keppel's life was going to take a very dark turn. At the age of 79, she wasn't in the bloom of her youth, and her health started to nosedive. That September, the legendary Mistress passed in her villa from cirrhosis of the liver. Against all odds, she remained married to her devoted husband of 56 years, George Keppel. Only, as it turned out, this was more a curse than a blessing. George and Alice always said they were perfectly fine with her duties as royal mistress. And believe it or not, they were actually telling the truth. They were so in love with each other at the very end that George Keppel actually realized he couldn't live without his Alice. He passed away just 2 months after his beloved, and they are now buried beside each other in Florence. Thanks for watching History Expose. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to keep exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, FactNate, for more incredible facts about everything